May 12, 1944. New York Harbor. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke. A smell Elena knew, but this was different. Heavier, thick with the damp chill of the Atlantic. She stood on the deck of the transport ship, her thin coat doing little to stop the wind from pressing the rough wool of her uniform against her skin. Below, the docks were a chaos of machinery and shouting men. Cranes like giant, skeletal birds swung nets of cargo from ship to shore. Everything was gray. The water, the sky, the steel hulls of the other ships. A gray, impossibly vast country. She clutched the small satchel that held everything she owned, a change of undergarments, a photograph of her brother in his Black Brigade's uniform, and a worn book of poetry. Her fingers traced the edge of the photograph through the canvas. A nervous habit. She scanned the faces of the American soldiers on the dock. They were so young, their faces smooth under their helmets. They chewed gum, a slow, rhythmic motion of the jaw that looked both indolent and arrogant. Propaganda posters had shown them as brutes, monsters with dripping fangs. These boys just looked bored. This was the first contradiction. She had braced herself for chains, for the rough grip of a guard, for the humiliation of being paraded as a spoil of war. Instead, there was only waiting. The line of women shuffled forward. No one shoved them. A voice, not unkind, gave an order in English, a language that sounded like stones rolling downhill. Another woman near her, a former lieutenant named Sophia, translated in a low murmur. "They're taking us to the trains." Elena felt the ramp beneath her boots, the solid feel of American land. She took a breath, expecting the metallic tang of fear. Instead, she smelled roasting coffee. Somewhere, someone was making coffee. The aroma was so normal, so civilian. It was the most terrifying thing she had yet encountered. They walked, not marched, walked through a cavernous building where light streamed through high, dirty windows. The sounds echoed, a cathedral of transit. Her gaze fixed on the back of the woman in front of her, the frayed collar of her jacket. Keep your eyes down. Show no weakness. This was the discipline they had been taught. But her eyes kept flicking up, taking in details. The neat lettering on a sign. The shine on a military police officer's boots. The way an American nurse, a woman in a crisp uniform so unlike their own, looked at them with an expression Elena couldn't decipher. Not hatred, not pity, something like curiosity, a clinical assessment. They were led to a train car. The seats were plush, covered in a dark green velvet that was worn but clean. She ran her hand over the fabric as she sat down. It felt impossibly soft. She thought of the splintered benches of the military trucks in Italy, the cold steel of transport planes. This was not the transport of a prisoner. This was how a citizen traveled. The train lurched into motion, pulling away from the city, away from the gray harbor. It moved slowly at first, then gathered speed, plunging them into the heart of the country that had defeated them. Elena looked out the window, her reflection a ghostly double over the passing landscape. She saw houses with green lawns, cars moving on paved roads, a world untouched by bombs, a world that hummed with an effortless prosperity. She had expected a cage. Instead, she had been given a window. The soft open loop of the journey had begun. Where it was taking her, and why they were being treated this way, was a mystery more unsettling than any threat of violence. The woman with the steady voice, Sophia, had been a nurse in Milan. She was older than most, her face lined with a weariness that went deeper than the transatlantic voyage. As the train cut through Pennsylvania, she became the quiet center of their car, a source of stability. The women around her were a strange collection, a cross-section of a dying regime. They were the auxiliary of the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile, the SAF. Volunteers, all of them, who had answered Mussolini's last call after the official Italian government had surrendered to the Allies. They were typists, nurses, radio operators, and clerks who had chosen a side with the German-backed Republic of Salo in the north. They had believed in the cause, or in a man, or simply in the idea of an Italy that had not capitulated. Captured during the final, brutal collapse of the Gothic Line, they were now prisoners of war, a designation that felt both absurd and terrifying. For them, the war had been a thing of scarcity and desperation. Of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and bread cut with sawdust. Of constant, gnawing uncertainty. Their world had been shrinking for months, collapsing into a few besieged towns in northern Italy. Now their world was violently expanding. America was not a place on a map. It was a physical sensation. It was the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels on an endless track, the sheer scale of the sky over the Ohio plains, the sight of factory smokestacks pouring wealth into the air. The journey itself was a lesson in logistics. The train was clean. It ran on time. At scheduled stops, American soldiers brought them food in cardboard boxes. Inside each was a sandwich made with thick slices of white bread and meat, an apple, and a small bar of chocolate. The first time Elena bit into the bread, she was stunned by its softness, its utter lack of grit. It was food without struggle. Food as a simple, abundant fact. The women ate in near silence, overwhelmed. They had been taught that America was a mongrel nation, decadent and weak, rotted from within by capitalism and jazz. But the evidence of their own senses contradicted every piece of propaganda. The system that was transporting them, its prisoners across a continent, was functioning with an efficiency that was staggering. It wasn't a show of force, of angry soldiers and snarling dogs. It was a show of profound, unshakable competence. This was the wider context they found themselves in. They were not just prisoners. They were a tiny, unique subset. Fewer than 600 Italian women in a system processing hundreds of thousands of male POWs from Germany, Italy, and Japan. They were an anomaly, and the system, while vast, had specific protocols for them. The Geneva Convention dictated their rights, a document most of them had never heard of, but which now governed every aspect of their existence. It stipulated the square footage of their living space, the caloric content of their meals, the type of labor they could be asked to perform. The stakes, as they whispered about it in the rattling train car at night, were immense and deeply personal. They had lost a war. Their country was now engaged in a vicious civil war, fascist against partisan, Italian against Italian. Their families were trapped in that chaos. And they were here, safe and well-fed, traveling deeper into the enemy's heartland. The risk was not to their bodies, they were beginning to realize. The risk was to their minds. The contrast began the moment they arrived at the camp, a place with a name like a poem and a reality that defied categorization. Camp Hereford, Texas. The discrepancy between what they had steeled themselves for and what they found was a daily, repetitive shock. It was a schism in reality, a constant source of whispered commentary in the barracks. The first and most stark contrast was the nature of their confinement. They had expected barbed wire, high fences, and guard towers manned by soldiers with machine guns. A cage. Instead, they found rows of simple, single-story wooden barracks laid out in a neat grid on the vast, flat expanse of the Texas Panhandle. The fence was there, yes, but it seemed almost perfunctory. The gate stood open for much of the day. There were guards, but they were older men, reservists from the local area who leaned against buildings and smoked, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They seemed less like jailers and more like bored groundskeepers. The women were assigned to barracks, each with rows of metal-framed beds. The mattresses were thin, but they had sheets, and pillows, and woolen blankets. This small domestic comfort, after months of sleeping on floors or in crowded transit camps, felt like a profound luxury. The second contrast was the food. In Italy, a meal was a memory or a hope. It was a constant, anxious calculation of rations. Here, a meal was a logistical certainty. 3 times a day, they lined up in the mess hall. The rumors from the train had not been exaggerated. They were served meat, potatoes, vegetables, milk, coffee with real sugar. The caloric intake was officially calculated at over 3,500 calories per day, a number so abstractly high it was meaningless until you felt its effect on your own body. The gnawing hunger that had been a constant companion for years simply vanished. For some, the richness of the food made them sick at first. Their bodies, accustomed to scarcity, rejected the sudden abundance. Sophia, the nurse, recognized the signs immediately and advised the younger women to eat slowly, to give their systems time to adapt. She saw the food not as kindness, but as a scientific application of resources, a physiological component of their imprisonment. The third contrast was labor. They had envisioned backbreaking, punitive work, digging ditches, breaking rocks, the kind of toil designed to break the spirit. Instead, their tasks were drawn from a list deemed suitable for women. They worked in the camp laundry, where enormous, churning machines did the heavy work. They worked in the hospital as aides, folding bandages and sterilizing equipment. Some with clerical skills were put to work in the administrative offices, typing records and filing reports for the American officers. The work was monotonous, but it was not brutal. It was structured, orderly, and deeply, recognizably feminine. Their hands, which they had pledged to the violent rebirth of their nation, were now employed in the mundane maintenance of the very system that held them captive. A fourth contrast was the interaction with their captors. The expectation was for harsh commands, for verbal abuse, for the constant threat of violence. The reality was a kind of detached, bureaucratic courtesy. The American officers, including the WACs who directly supervised them, addressed them formally. The guards rarely spoke to them, and when they did, it was with a clumsy, almost shy demeanor. A young guard might offer a stick of chewing gum. An older officer might ask about their families. These small gestures were profoundly disorienting. A beating they could have understood. A curse they could have returned with defiant silence. But how were they to respond to this polite, systematic, and utterly impersonal care? It was a form of control so subtle it left no bruises. It simply removed the possibility of heroic resistance. There was nothing to fight against. Among the women, three distinct perspectives began to emerge, three ways of processing the profound cognitive dissonance of their new lives. They became archetypes, their internal states a reflection of the group's wider confusion. Elena, the young idealist from Bologna, became the chronicler of contradiction. She had been a university student, her mind sharp and trained to see patterns. Now, she applied that same analytical rigor to her captivity. She kept a mental ledger. On one side, the tenets of her faith, the promise of fascist glory, the belief in sacrifice, the righteousness of their cause. On the other side, the mounting evidence of Camp Hereford, the clean sheets, the penicillin in the infirmary, the casual way the American quartermaster ordered supplies by the ton. Her interiority was a constant, churning debate. She would lie on her bunk at night, the strange Texas wind whistling around the barracks, and try to reconcile the two columns. How could a decadent society produce such perfectly standardized machine parts? How could a weak democracy project this much effortless power across an ocean? She worked in the camp's administrative office, her fluent English a valuable skill for the Americans. There, she saw the paperwork of power, the requisitions, the supply manifests, the personnel files. She saw that their humane treatment was not an emotional whim. It was a line item in a budget, a policy dictated by a manual. This discovery did not comfort her. It felt colder, more alienating. It meant they were cogs in a machine they couldn't even comprehend. Then there was Sophia, the pragmatic nurse from Milan. Sophia was in her late 40s, a widow whose only son had been killed on the Russian front fighting for the same cause that now imprisoned her. But where Elena saw ideology, Sophia saw systems. She had no time for abstract debates. Her focus was on the material world. In the infirmary, she noted the quality of the American medical supplies. The bandages were individually wrapped in sterile paper. The scalpels were stainless steel, not the chrome-plated instruments that rusted in Italy. She observed the WAC officer in charge, a Captain Miller, and saw not an enemy, but a competent administrator. She noticed how the captain's orders were followed without question, how the supply chain for the hospital ran with a quiet, relentless efficiency. Sophia's internal monologue was a series of checks and counts. How many units of plasma were in the refrigerator? How many bars of soap were in the storeroom? She measured the health of the system by its outputs. And by every metric she knew, the American system was terrifyingly healthy. Her form of resistance was competence. She performed her duties with a severe, unimpeachable professionalism that earned the grudging respect of the American staff. She was showing them that an Italian, a fascist, could be just as disciplined as they were. But privately, a seed of doubt had been planted. Her son had died for a cause that could not even keep its hospitals properly supplied. The third lens was Julia, a fierce young woman from Rome who had been a radio operator. For her, everything was a trick. The good food was an attempt to soften them, to make them compliant. The polite guards were a psychological weapon, designed to lull them into a false sense of security before the real indoctrination began. Julia was a sentinel of skepticism. She watched everyone. She noted the patrol patterns of the guards, looking for anomalies. She listened to the tone of the American officers, searching for a hint of condescension or a flicker of contempt. Her inner state was one of high alert. She warned the other women not to trust the Americans, not to accept their small kindnesses. "They are trying to buy your soul with chocolate," she'd hiss in the barracks at night. But even her certainty began to fray at the edges. The trick never materialized. There were no high-pressure interrogations, no mandatory re-education classes. There was only the endless, monotonous, comfortable routine of the camp. The weapon wasn't hidden. The weapon was the routine. It was the crushing boredom, the soul-killing absence of a struggle. The system didn't need to attack their beliefs. It was simply ignoring them into obsolescence. The phenomenon of Camp Hereford was not an accident. It was the product of a massive, deliberately designed architecture, a system of logistics, policy, and cultural assumptions that was invisible to most Americans but defined the entire world for the prisoners within it. For women like Elena, working in the administrative office, the blueprints of this system were laid bare in the daily flood of paperwork. The foundational layer was policy, codified in the Articles of the 1929 Geneva Convention. This was the master algorithm. For Elena, who first read a translated summary of the document, it was a revelation. It stated that prisoners of war must be humanely treated and protected from acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. It dictated minimum standards for housing, food, and clothing, equivalent to those of the detaining power's own garrison troops. The United States, as a signatory, had built its entire POW program on this legal framework. The policy wasn't about kindness. It was about international law and reciprocity, a calculated measure to ensure better treatment for American soldiers captured by the Axis. Elena saw this in the meticulous records kept for the International Red Cross, which conducted periodic inspections of the camp. Every blanket, every meal, every complaint was documented, not for posterity, but for legal compliance. The second layer was the massive logistical infrastructure of the U.S. Army Service Forces. This was the mechanism that turned policy into reality. The women saw its output every day. They saw the trains that arrived on a precise schedule, delivering crates of canned goods from California, sacks of potatoes from Idaho, sides of beef from Chicago. Sophia, in the infirmary, would watch them unload medical supplies. Boxes of sulfa powder, vials of penicillin, rolls of sterile gauze, and marvel at the sheer scale of it all. This logistical power was America's schematic metaphor for itself, a continent-spanning conveyor belt that moved resources with relentless, overwhelming efficiency. It was a power that didn't need to shout. Its strength was expressed in the quiet hum of its well-oiled machinery. The system delivered not just survival, but surplus. The final layer was cultural, a set of gendered assumptions about the prisoners themselves. Because they were women, they were automatically categorized as a lower security risk. The camp administration operated on the belief that women were less likely to attempt escape, less prone to organized violence, and more suited to domestic or clerical labor. Julia, the skeptic, saw this everywhere. She noticed that the inspections of the women's barracks were less frequent and less thorough than those she heard about from the nearby men's camps. She saw that the work assignments, laundry, sewing, hospital aid, were a direct reflection of American ideas about women's roles. They were being held captive not just by fences and guards, but by a cultural projection, an idea of what a woman prisoner should be. This gendering of their captivity was both a source of relative comfort and a subtle form of erasure. The system treated them with a kind of paternalistic care, but it also stripped them of their identity as political soldiers. They were not seen as committed fascists who had taken up arms for a cause, but as misguided women who needed to be managed. This quiet, systemic invalidation of their political identity was, for many, the most disarming tactic of all. The machine didn't care what they believed. It only cared that they were fed on time, that their work quotas were met, and that the paperwork was filed in triplicate. As the months wore on, a new kind of contrast began to take shape, one that pushed the women's disorientation to a new level. It was the contrast not between expectation and reality, but between their lives inside the camp and the carefully controlled glimpses they were given of the world outside. The setting for this new lesson was the nearby town of Hereford. Occasionally, under the supervision of a WAC officer and a single, armed guard, small groups of women who had demonstrated good behavior were taken into town. Sometimes it was to work in a local cannery during the harvest season. Other times, it was for a supervised shopping trip at the local general store, using the small scrip allowance they earned from their labor. The first trip into Hereford was a sensory assault. After the monotonous brown and olive green of the camp, the colors of the town were shocking. The bright red of a Coca-Cola sign, the cheerful yellow of a storefront, the deep blue of a woman's dress. For Elena, the most astonishing sight was the grocery store. She stood on the sidewalk and stared through the plate glass window, mesmerized. There were pyramids of polished apples, mountains of oranges, rows upon rows of canned goods with brightly printed labels. She saw American housewives, women their own age, moving through the aisles with shopping carts, casually selecting items. She heard one woman complain to another about the rationing of sugar. The word felt obscene in the face of such plenty. To complain about a limitation on sweetness in a world that was overflowing with food, it was a level of entitlement so profound it bordered on the surreal. The second comparison came from observing American women themselves. The prisoners saw them driving automobiles, their hair blowing in the wind. They saw them wearing trousers, walking with a stride that seemed confident and unburdened. They saw teenage girls laughing and talking with boys on street corners, an easy, informal interaction that would have been scandalous back home. These American women seemed to possess a freedom of movement and a social autonomy that was utterly foreign. They were not auxiliary to men. They seemed to operate in a sphere of their own. For the Italian women, whose lives had been governed by the rigid, patriarchal structures of both traditional Italian society and fascism, this was a powerful and unsettling vision of an alternative way of being. Finally, there was the contrast in the built environment. The town of Hereford, like the camp, was pragmatic and unadorned. The buildings were new, the streets were wide, everything was arranged in a logical grid. It lacked the deep, layered history of an Italian town. There was no ancient piazza, no 1,000-year-old church. Everything felt temporary, as if it could be disassembled and moved if a more efficient location were found. It was a landscape of a culture that believed in the future, not the past. A single data point lodged in Sophia's memory from one of these trips. In a window of the general store, there was a display of nylon stockings, a material she had only read about. A small sign listed the price, 95 cents. She did the conversion in her head. It was less than a day's wages for an unskilled American factory worker. The ability to purchase such an impossible luxury, not with a month's savings, but as a casual, everyday transaction. That single price tag told her more about the economic power of America than any propaganda film ever could. The cumulative effect of these experiences was a slow, grinding friction against the bedrock of their ideology. The core assumptions that had led them to volunteer for Mussolini's republic were being systematically violated, not by force, but by the overwhelming evidence of their senses. Their fascist worldview, a grand and romantic ideology built on struggle, sacrifice, and the promise of a heroic future, was proving to be a poor map for the territory they now inhabited. A central tenet of their belief system was that democracy was weak, chaotic, and inefficient, a decadent system doomed to collapse. But nothing about the American war machine, as they experienced it, was weak. Elena, sitting at her typewriter in the camp office, saw the sheer, boring, bureaucratic strength of it all. It was a system that could classify, transport, house, feed, and manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners thousands of miles from their homes with a seeming lack of effort. This was not the chaotic weakness they had been promised. It was a calm, distributed, and terrifyingly robust form of power. Another core belief was that Americans were undisciplined, soft individualists, incapable of the collective will necessary to win a total war. This was directly contradicted by the women they saw every day, the American WACs who ran their section of the camp. Captain Miller, the commanding officer, was a woman in her 30s, professional, calm, and perpetually efficient. She was not a warrior in the romantic sense, but she was an expert manager of complex systems. The women watched her conduct inspections, approve requisitions, and resolve disputes with an air of unshakable authority. They saw the female nurses in the infirmary, the clerks in the offices, all performing their duties with a quiet competence that needed no grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It was a different model of strength, one based on process and professionalism rather than passionate fervor. Occasionally, a moment of role inversion would scramble the power dynamics completely. One afternoon, a young American medic in the infirmary was struggling to set a splint on the broken arm of a fellow guard. He was clumsy, unsure of the angles. Sophia, who had treated hundreds of shrapnel and bullet wounds on the front lines, watched for a moment, her patience wearing thin. Finally, she stepped forward. Without asking permission, she gently pushed the young man aside. "No," she said in her heavily accented but precise English. "The pressure must be here. Like this." She took the bandages and, with swift, expert movements, secured the splint correctly. The medic, a boy of no more than 19, stared at her, his face flushing with embarrassment. For a brief moment, she was not the prisoner and he was not the guard. She was the expert, and he was the novice. It was a small assertion of competence, but in the closed world of the camp, it was a significant event. The women in the barracks began to ask themselves the forbidden questions. What if the world wasn't as their leaders had described it? What if the strength they had been taught to admire, the strength of parades, rallies, and violence, was actually a brittle facade, and true power lay in the silent, grinding gears of logistics and production? To the women themselves, these realizations were not abstract. They were grounded in the tangible evidence they could see and touch, a daily accumulation of facts that slowly built an irrefutable case. The narrative of their captivity was written in numbers, records, and the specifics of their routine. Their first encounter with the scale of the system was numerical. They knew they were a small group, somewhere around 550 women in total. They were housed in specific camps designated for them, first at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, then consolidated at Camp Hereford in Texas, with a smaller contingent of medical staff sent to a hospital at Camp Patrick Henry in Virginia. They were acutely aware of their rarity. This small number made them a curiosity, but it also made them manageable, a rounding error in a system that held nearly 400,000 German and Italian male POWs. The women saw the evidence of this larger system all around them. They saw the endless freight trains passing near the camp, laden with tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, a constant reminder of the industrial might they were up against. Elena, in her clerical role, became the unofficial archivist of their reality. She typed the weekly menus for the mess hall, and her fingers registered the facts: beef roast on Sunday, chicken on Wednesday, pork on Friday. She saw the quarterly requisitions for clothing, thousands of pairs of cotton-work gloves, hundreds of bolts of denim fabric, crates of leather boots. She filed the medical reports from the infirmary, noting the routine dispensing of aspirin, sulfa drugs, and even dental care. These were not acts of charity. They were line items, a fulfillment of treaty obligations, evidence of a system functioning exactly as designed. The evidence also came through the mail. Their letters home were a crucial, if painful, link to their former lives. The process was governed by strict rules, filtered through the women's own experiences. Julia learned quickly that any mention of politics, any hint of lingering fascist loyalty, would result in the letter being returned by the American censors with the offending passages blacked out. They learned to write in a kind of code, speaking of health and good food, in ways they hoped their families would understand were not sarcastic. The letters they received back were even more revealing. They were thin, often delayed for months, the paper of poor quality. Between the lines of family news, they pieced together a picture of a homeland in ruins. A sister's mention of the difficulties in finding flour was a confirmation of the near starvation they had left behind. The news of a neighbor's house being destroyed in an Allied bombing raid was read aloud in the quiet of the barracks, a stark reminder of the physical reality of the war they were now spared. They were living in a strange paradox. The safest place for a committed Italian fascist in 1944 was inside an American prisoner of war camp. This fact, more than any other, was the most damning piece of evidence. It was an inversion of the natural order of things, a logical absurdity that could not be reconciled with their political faith. Their cause was losing, their country was being destroyed, and they were here, protected and provided for by the very enemy they had sworn to defeat. The sustained cognitive dissonance began to exert a heavy price. The humane treatment, the relentless efficiency, the undeniable evidence of American power. It was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any physical abuse. The emotional toll landed squarely in the bodies and beliefs of the women, a slow-motion collapse of the certainties that had once defined them. For Elena, the internal conflict manifested as a constant, low-grade fever of guilt. The plentiful food in the mess hall became a source of torment. Every bite of soft white bread, every spoonful of sugar in her coffee, was an act of betrayal. She would picture her family in Bologna, living under occupation, scrounging for scraps, and the food would turn to ash in her mouth. She grew thin, not from lack of food, but from a surfeit of shame. Her sleep was fractured by anxious dreams where she was trying to explain herself to her brother, to justify her safety, her comfort, but the words would not come. The psychological cost was also one of identity. They had arrived as soldiers, believers in a cause. The camp system, with its polite, bureaucratic indifference, was quietly stripping that identity away. They were being redefined, not as political actors, but as inmates, as cases to be managed. Julia felt this erasure most acutely. Her fierce, defiant spirit had nothing to push against. There were no brutal guards to hate, no overt injustices to protest. In the absence of a clear enemy, her anger began to turn inward. She became withdrawn, her sarcastic barbs replaced by a sullen silence. The fire in her was being extinguished not by force, but by a bland, soul-crushing routine. One evening, the emotional strain found its breaking point. A young woman named Isabella, a quiet girl who mostly kept to herself, received a letter from home. It was from the Red Cross. It informed her, in sparse, formal language, that her parents and younger sister had been killed during a partisan raid on their village. They had been executed as fascist collaborators. The news spread through the barracks in whispers. Isabella sat on her bunk, staring at the wall, the letter clutched in her hand. She did not cry out or scream. She simply began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that seemed to come from the very marrow of her bones. Sophia went to her, tried to hold her, but the girl was rigid, locked in a state of shock beyond comfort. The other women gathered around, a silent, helpless circle. The raw, unfiltered grief of the Italian Civil War had breached the sterile walls of the camp. It was a grief that felt obscene in this place of clean sheets and regular meals. That night, the fragile discipline of the barracks shattered. The quiet weeping started with one woman, then another, a contagion of sorrow for Isabella, for their families, for their lost country, for themselves. In the darkness, huddled in her bunk, Elena felt a profound sense of dislocation. They were mourning a world that no longer existed, prisoners of an enemy who insisted on treating them with a decency that felt like the cruelest mockery of all. Later, in the deepest quiet of the night, Julia's voice came from the next bunk, a raw whisper cutting through the dark. "Sophia," she said, her voice hoarse. "Maybe they were right about us. Maybe we were the monsters all along." It was not a question. It was a surrender. The moment of revelation did not arrive like a thunderclap. It was a quiet, cold dawn of understanding that reconfigured everything that had come before. It crystallized for Sophia one morning as she stood by the window of the infirmary, watching the daily flag-raising ceremony. The American flag ascended the pole with a smooth, mechanical precision. The WACs and GIs on the parade ground stood at attention, their movements synchronized but without the theatrical stiffness of a fascist rally. They looked, she thought, like employees at a very large, very successful corporation. And in that moment, the entire experience of their captivity snapped into focus, reinterpreted through a single, devastating insight. The most effective weapon used against them was not a gun, or a bomb, or an ideology, but a well-run system of bureaucratic competence. This was the turn. It was a realization that shifted their struggle from a grand, romantic conflict of national wills to a mundane, administrative defeat. The implications of this insight spread quickly, rewriting their past and redefining their future. The first implication was that their entire value system had been rendered irrelevant. Fascism, as they had known it, was an ideology of the grand gesture. It celebrated passionate speeches, heroic violence, and a contempt for the small, boring details of administration. They had been defeated by an enemy that fetishized those very details. America's power, Sophia now understood, was not located in its ideals of freedom and democracy, which seemed abstract and distant. Its true power was in its inventory management, its standardized parts, its ability to generate and analyze data, its mastery of logistics. They had brought a knife to a fight against a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet had won without even noticing they were there. The second implication was that the humane treatment they had received was not a sign of moral superiority or kindness. It was simply the most efficient option. It was cheaper and more effective to keep prisoners healthy and compliant than to deal with the costs of disease, malnutrition, and rebellion. Kindness was a feature of the system's design, a calculated input to maximize order and minimize expense. This realization was colder and more terrifying than the idea of a benevolent conqueror. It meant they were not even worthy of their enemy's hatred. They were just a column of figures in a complex equation, a problem of resource management that had been solved. Finally, this revelation offered a new, humiliating explanation for their defeat. They had not been outfought. They had been outproduced and outorganized. Their cause had not been crushed by a superior warrior spirit, but made obsolete by a superior system of supply. The war, from the American perspective, was not an epic struggle for the soul of humanity. It was the largest industrial project in human history. For Elena, for Julia, for all the women, this new understanding was the final stage of their disarmament. Their guns had been taken in Italy. Their pride and their ideology had been dismantled here, in Texas, by the quiet, relentless evidence of American administrative power. The synthesis of this strange war story lies in connecting the small, human-scale moments of disbelief to the large, system-scale meaning they revealed. The arc of the Italian women POWs was a journey from ideological certainty to profound systemic shock. Each intimate observation became a data point in a new and unwelcome education. Elena's first taste of soft, white American bread was more than a sensory experience. It was her first direct contact with the output of a vast, industrialized agricultural system. It was the end product of a causal chain that began with mechanized farming on the Great Plains, moved through a national railway network, and ended with a military procurement system that could deliver fresh bread to a remote POW camp in Texas. That simple object demonstrated a capacity for surplus that their own war-torn economy could no longer imagine. Sophia's admiration for the neatly wrapped sterile bandages in the infirmary was a recognition of the power of standardization. In Italy, a hospital's effectiveness was often dependent on the ingenuity of its staff to make do with scarce and varied supplies. Here, effectiveness was a product of a system that ensured every bandage, every vial, every needle was a perfect, reliable, and endlessly replaceable copy. This was the logic of the assembly line applied to medicine, and it was a force that individual heroism could not match. The system of humane treatment, as dictated by the Geneva Convention and executed by the U.S. Army, was designed to achieve compliance and gather intelligence. The intended effect may have been to foster gratitude or even ideological conversion. However, the actual effect on these women was something far more complex. It did not necessarily make them love America, but it did tend to dismantle their faith in the fascist project. It replaced the clear, sharp hatred of an enemy with a disorienting fog of confusion and doubt. It showed them that the world was not governed by the romantic ideals of struggle and sacrifice, but by the cold, hard mathematics of production and distribution. The motif of their hands told the story. These were the hands of women who had typed Mussolini's propaganda, operated as radios, and nursed as soldiers. In America, these same hands were put to work in the service of their captor system. They folded American uniforms, filed American paperwork, and tended gardens that grew American vegetables. The work itself was a form of re-education, a daily, tactile lesson in a different way of organizing the world. They were not being lectured on the virtues of democracy. They were being integrated into its mundane, operational rhythms. Their captivity demonstrated that a system's most powerful statement is often not its declared ideals, but its functional reality. America did not need to win a debate with these women. It simply had to show them how it worked. We return to the image of a woman on a train platform, taking her first steps into a new and bewildering continent. The feel of the solid ground beneath her feet, the smell of coffee in the air, the shocking absence of the expected brutality. That moment of sensory confusion was the beginning of a war fought not with weapons, but with bread, with clean sheets, with paperwork. It was a conflict fought inside the minds of Elena, Sophia, Julia, and hundreds of other women, a struggle to reconcile the world they had been promised with the one they had found. For many, that quiet, internal war never truly ended. What does it mean when the enemy you've been taught to hate refuses to act like a monster? What happens to your convictions when they're not attacked, but are simply and quietly rendered irrelevant by a system of overwhelming, impersonal competence? The story of these women pushes us to look past the simple, clean narratives of war, the easy distinctions between good and evil. It suggests that one of the most profound forms of power is not the ability to destroy, but the ability to organize. If their experience unsettles your assumptions, it is doing its work. The next time you encounter a story of conflict, notice what contradictions are being smoothed over and whose experiences are being left in the margins. The journey of these women did not end in Texas. Their repatriation to a broken and bitterly divided Italy would present a new set of challenges, forcing them to navigate a world that saw them as traitors, ghosts of a dead regime. To understand what happened when these women finally went home, subscribe to our channel and join us for the next part of this story.